Hello, I want to thank everyone for coming. My name is Jim Carafano. I'm the Vice President for Foreign Defense Policy at the Heritage Foundation. So I know all of you share with me the enormous, incredible disappointment of California Chrome not taking the Triple Crown, right? I am totally crushed. So this is your consolation prize, and actually it's actually a very, very good one, because this absolutely is a true Triple Crown moment. First of all, this lecture is sponsored by a family and Americans, which are just an extraordinary couple who are just amazing patriots, and you'll hear more about them, and accomplished things, and their generosity in helping us do this is really remarkable. So you're going to hear some more about them. We have an extraordinary speaker who I think is one of the great American minds of the 21st century, and you're going to hear more about that. But I'm going to talk about the central jewel of the crown, which is we do this event to commemorate in cooperation with the Marine Corps University Foundation, which is an extraordinary national American treasure. This is the 70th anniversary of, we just had the 70th anniversary of D-Day. And yes, there actually were Marines at D-Day. There was about 12, but they were there. But there are a lot of D-Days. So some of the other days, MacArthur alone had 52 amphibious landings, and there have been a lot of Marines in every American war. And behind those Marines is the inspiration and the leadership and the smarts and intelligence to prepare them for their job. And that's the responsibility of the Marine Corps Professional Military Education System. And the Marine Corps University Foundation is responsible for making sure that helping all the tools are in the arsenal to give them the intellectual weight to really do that. And it's been an honor to work with the foundation, and to introduce our introducer is General Droughty, who is the President and CEO of the Marine Corps University Foundation, and himself an incredibly distinguished soldier, an incredibly great scholar who we've had here before, actually helping us think through some things, and an extraordinary steward and mentor of a terrific foundation, which does amazing things to help support the people that keep you safe every day. So on that, I will turn over to General Droughty.
Thank you, Dr. Carafano, and what a pleasure it is to share a few words with you and to make an introduction. Dr. Carafano mentioned the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the president of the Marine Corps University is here with us today, Brigadier General Tom Widely, and afterwards we're going to get a chance to have a reception. I hope you get a chance to chat with him to find out about the fantastic things that are happening down at Quantico under his leadership at the Marine Corps University. Also, with my foundation are three of my staff, Angela Blackiston and John Hales and Valerie Brown. So again, afterwards, if you would like to hear more about what we do, which I'll capture in just a simple statement, we change lives and save lives. Now, this is something I normally don't do in introducing the introducer, but this is such a rich background that I think you should know that if you forgive me, I will read it. Colonel James D. McGinley spent his entire career protecting American interests both at home and abroad. At home, he had a noteworthy legal career protecting individuals from insurance bad faith practices by HMOs. In 1996, his success as a litigation partner was highlighted with a cover story in Time magazine. Separately, Colonel McGinley served a distinguished 30-year career as a naval aviator in the United States Marine Corps. Focusing his leadership skills abroad, he volunteered for 3 combat tours and earned both the Legion of Merit and the Bronze Star. And he retired from the Marine Corps in April 2013. But that's just half of the team. Rare in the arts community, Mary Beth Walton McGinley has spent her life dedicated to conservative principles. Since the early 1980s, when she received gold records for art directing the albums E.T., The Extraterrestrial, and Return of the Jedi, Mary Beth has earned an admirable reputation for successful business ownership and creative development focused on the entertainment industry. In 2002, she was appointed by President George W. Bush and confirmed by the full Senate to serve a 6-year term as a member of the National Council on the Arts. The McGinleys have a special relationship with heritage dating back to its earliest days. After serving as the Secretary of Business and Transportation for then Governor Reagan, Mary Beth's father, the Honorable Frank J. Walton, served as president of Heritage from 1975 to 1977. The McGinleys are dedicated to a host of important conservative issues, from religious liberty to national defense. We at the Heritage and McCuff are proud to honor these two great patriots through the annual Colonel James D. McGinley Lecture. And with that, I'll turn it over to Colonel McGinley, Esquire, doctor, and postmaster's degree, and a true American friend and patriot.
General, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. While I have the opportunity, what I want to do just very quickly is recognize a few of the people we have in the audience today. First of all, General Meese, so good to see you, and Ursula, we appreciate your being able to be here with us. And then I was looking to see if I see Admiral Klein. Has she made it in yet? When she does, currently now serving as the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Military Professionalism, former Chief of Staff for Cybercom. And then General Larry Taylor. We have General Taylor? Hoorah. My former wing commander out in the 4th Wing. Good to have him. And Ms. Jenny Thomas, right over here. Special correspondent with the Daily Caller. And very good to see you, Jenny. And of course, I couldn't move beyond any of this if I didn't take just a quick moment to recognize President Ed Fulner, now more in the emeritus role, but so much of what we have seen in the way of influence of Heritage over the years is directly attributed to his leadership and unbelievable dedication, and the fact you could be here with us today is a true honor. Ed, good to see you. Well, in this age of 24-hour news cycles, unending spin, and public figures that are willing to broadly distort the truth, it can be exceedingly difficult to understand critical events in context and comprehend their effects on American culture. From a pilot's perspective, it's time to climb to 30,000 feet and get the big picture. Our speaker, Victor Davis Hanson, as a classicist and an historian, brings the depth of analysis that delivers the kind of vision that readily brings complex issues into clear focus. Like a modern-day Alexis de Tocqueville, his writing is both penetrating and noteworthy for its insightful clarity. Dr. Hanson is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and an expert on the history of war. He has written or edited 23 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Carnage and Culture, Landmark Battles in the Rise of Western Power. He was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Bush in 2007 and the Bradley Prize in 2008, and has been a visiting professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, Stanford University, Hillsdale College, and Pepperdine University. Dr. Hanson received his PhD in classics from Stanford University in 1980. In a few moments, Dr. Hanson will share his insights on World War I and the lessons for today. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce one of the foremost conservative writers of our time. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Victor Davis Hanson.
I'll try to speak just 35 minutes, and I'd welcome questions the rest of the allotted time. I mentioned to my host that if I sound a little different, I had a bad accident 3.5 weeks ago, and I have 75 stitches in my mouth and broke my nose. So this is the first time I've been out, and I hope you don't think I'm as crazy as I feel. We're schizophrenic about World War I. If you read the late John Keegan, or Neil Ferguson, World War I was a catastrophe. It was an in-house squabble between like-minded European constitutional monarchies that could have been prevented. Instead, 8 million people went to their deaths for no reason. If you read other accounts, it was a spirited defense, an enlightened defense, a heroic defense against the aggressions of Prussian militarism that would have left Europe with a very different trajectory. I'm interested, though, in the denouement of World War I and what its influence was on the United States both before World War II and to this present day. The thing to remember was that was really the first American war that did not end in what we would call unconditional surrender, as or victory and defeat in the way that the Spanish-American War had, or the Civil War had, or the Mexican War had. Remember, it was more like the Korean War. It ended in an armistice on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. And the actual peace treaty, which took place at Versailles, was not enacted till the next year. And that was very difficult because for that 6 months of squabbling, which was not resolved at Versailles at the Trianon Hotel until June of 1919, a considerable amount of the military power on the Allies' part had been demobilized. Remember one thing about World War I, we keep being impressed, as we should, about the productive capacity of the United States in World War II. After all, we produced 300 aircraft frames in World War II. We outproduced the Soviets in artillery platforms and tanks. We had produced more airplanes, in fact, than all the belligerents in World War II put together. It was just a fantastic achievement, producing a B-24 finally won an hour at Willow Run. But World War I was somewhat even more impressive because we started with essentially no army and no artillery, of course we had no airplanes, we had no tanks, which were, by 1916, were a new revolutionary weapon. And when we declared war on this Central Powers, April of 1917, we had no military. Fast forward a year later, we were only in the war a year and a half, we had sent over 1 million men to Europe. And by the end of the war, we had mobilized over 2 million people. And because we came in late, and we had the fewest casualties of the Allied powers, and we were the most decisive, we sort of felt that we had won the war, even though by any measure of fairness, the sacrifices of France and Britain had been much more considerable. But then we had this Versailles Treaty, which we felt, remember, this was not called World War I. That term did not originate. It was sporadic in the late 30s, but it didn't become institutionalized until the beginning of World War II. It was the Great War, and the war to end all wars. And that was because of this enormous mobilization and bringing over 1 million people without losing a single soldier in 1918, we had enormous prestige. And Woodrow Wilson, we make fun of him today, but if you look at the exact text of the 14-point speech that he gave as sort of a preliminary outline of what he wanted to see enacted at Versailles, it's not that radical. It's more or less that there's going to be freedom of use of the seas, national boundaries will be adjudicated in transparent fashion, there will be a League of Nations, a little bit utopian, but it wasn't that radical. We also think that in this peace treaty, the Big Four, Mr. Orlando from Italy didn't play that much of a part. It was basically David Lloyd George of Britain, Clemenceau of France, and Wilson were punitive. In other words, they had a Carthaginian peace, as John Maynard Keynes said. If you remember his best-selling book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was very influential. And the idea was that Germany had been punished under the Versailles Treaty, and that idea came from, it's a massive document, 400 pages, but there were certain things in it that we focused on. One of them, of course, was Germany would not be allowed to have an army over 100,000 people in it, soldiers. It would not have a general staff. It could not have an armored force. It could not have an air force. It had to give up its Pacific and African, small as they were, colonies. It had to give back the Alsace-Lorraine. It had to negate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that had imposed on the Soviet Union. It had reparations to pay, and on and on. This was considered very punitive. But if you, like the 14 points, if you actually look at the terms of the Versailles Treaty, it's very hard to see how that was punitive in two different ways. Remember that asking for the Alsace-Lorraine back it had been taken from France in the Prussian War of 1871. So basically Germany had it and they wanted more. It wasn't, World War I wasn't fought to take the Alsace, it was to take 50, 60% of France. And if you look at culpability for the war, I mean, France did not invade Germany, Britain did not invade Germany, United States did not invade Germany. Germany invaded on both fronts. And so to say that they were culpable seems to make some sense. Now, reparations are a very controversial subject because people who were for them say that they wouldn't have destroyed the German economy had the Germans not stopped paying, deliberately inflated their currency to pay in cheaper marks. And then there's who say, well, the problem with reparations were that the United States was lending Germany money so Germany could pay reparations to Britain so Britain could pay the United States back its war debt, which was true. But that's a different issue about whether it would have worked or not. Germany had a series of government-sponsored strikes that deliberately slowed down the economy and a deliberate policy of inflation. My point is that if you look what Wilson said and what the Allies imposed on Germany, it was not that far-fetched, but there was a problem. I'll get to that in a minute. But before I do, one of the ways we can adjudicate the Versailles Treaty is to look at other treaties in that same era involving World War I and later that Germany had imposed on others. So when Germany invaded in August of 1914, and it looked like there would be no miracle at the Marne and it was going to take France, they had a so-called September program of Professor Reisling, who later ended up at Columbia University, United States. And you should read that document. That would be the peace that Germany thought it would impose on France and Belgium by December 1914. There wasn't going to be an independent Belgium. It would cease to exist. It would be a protectorate of Germany, and Germany needed, it said, Atlantic ports, so all of the French ports were going to be German-controlled, and there was going to be a permanent annexation of about 40 or 50 miles beyond the Alsace-Lorraine, and France was going to be disarmed in a way that Germany, nobody had ever imagined, even Germany would be after the war, the victors. If we look at the treaty compared to what Germany imposed on Russia when it was defeated in late 1917 at the Brest-Litovsk, in March of 1918 it was finalized, you should read that treaty. Germany in World War I under Versailles lost 20,000 square miles. It took away from the newly Soviet Union, it took away 1 million square miles. It lost 5 to 8% of its industrial capacity under the Versailles Treaty. It took from Russia about 40% of its industrial capacity. It lost about 5 to 7 million German speakers that were now outside the orbit of Germany, and 65 million Russian speakers or Ukrainian speakers, or let's say non-German speakers, were now to be incorporated in the German Reich. So by any contemporary standard, Versailles was pretty light. If you compare it to what happened after World War II, Germany was not occupied except for portions of the Rhineland. There was a protectorate with an election in the Saar. It was very mild into what the Allies imposed on Germany after World War II. That being said, and here's where we get to, I think, some of the lessons of World War I, if the Versailles Treaty was not necessarily punitive or Carthaginian in comparison with what followed or what Germany itself would have done to other people, then why did we have World War II? Because after all, the standard exegesis is that a crippled Germany, unduly blamed for something that was beyond its own control, was forced into poverty, and then the conditions were so desperate that somebody like Hitler came to power and was able to sort of hijack German democracy, and by 1933 we were on the road to World War II. That is all true, but it doesn't deal with the main point. The Versailles Treaty would have worked had it been enforced, and the problem with the Versailles Treaty is it was humiliating, yes. Nothing's worse than be humiliating, but it was also weak. There were no methods of enforcement. The United States had a great debate about the League of Nations, but the idea that a country would surrender its right to make war didn't make sense to people in the United States, both Republican and Democrat. We never ratified that, but that was a formal idea that there was going to be a group of preeminent nations that would enforce the elements of the Versailles Treaty. When we backed out of that and everybody went home, there was only one country, the one in greatest jeopardy, France, that was in charge of enforcing the elements of the Versailles Treaty. Britain quickly said that Britain had the luxury of doing that because, after all, it was a sea power and it had the English Channel, but it basically backed out of enforcement. And France was in the difficult position, it had a smaller population, smaller territory, even than a weakened Germany, of trying to enforce reparations, trying to enforce a demilitarization of the Rhineland. And at one time it went in and took over the coal mines. It tried to forcibly extract resources from Germany, but it was in a difficult position. And so what happened with Versailles was that the Allies pontificated, they lectured, they sermonized about Germany is going to do this, Germany is going to do this, and then almost immediately they had a crisis of confidence. They had been too mean, the Depression took over, reparations were considered the problem, and they did not enforce the statutes. And they created the worst of diplomatic scenarios you could imagine. That is to talk tough, to talk loudly, and to have a small stick. They talked just loudly enough to humiliate Germany, but not loudly enough or with not enough force behind it to ensure that they were defeated and they were humiliated, and they understood that in the way that they did in World War II. Now, I'd like to just briefly, before we get to the American lessons of World War I, just go through the 4 or 5 belligerents and see how this affected them. For France, after World War I, there were some certain messages. One is that they could not defeat Germany by themselves. They had to have a British army on the continent, and they had to have the entrance of America. And so in their way of thinking, those were both wild cards that may not happen again. And it was very tragic because the winners of World War I got the wrong lessons and the losers got the right ones. The right lessons were that a static warfare would be inconsequential and that it would be costly and that you had to have some type of mobility. The Germans were experimenting with tanks and mobile artillery at a much faster rate, and yet Germany only produced 8 tanks in World War I. France produced over 5,000. France was the premier armor power of World War I. And when the war ended, the problem wasn't that they invested 1 or 2% of their gross national product in the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line would have worked had it been used in concert with a sophisticated mobile artillery and armored force, and it wasn't. And this was extremely catastrophic because as far as technology goes, France military technology was superior to Germany all the way up till 1939. The French Char tank was 5 times better than the Mark I, Mark II, and Mark III German tank. German artillery was almost as good as the German French artillery as the German 88. When Germany invaded France in May of 1940, France had superior and more numerous tanks. They had a greater army, and in theory they could have won. But the problem was that they were terrified from World War I that their allies were not committed to a collective defense, and they had thought that somehow they had paid too much of a price and they were not going to get in that situation again. And so they began not to worry about the systematic violations of the Versailles Treaty, whether it was the rearmament of the German Wehrmacht, or it was the occupation of the Rhineland, or it was the perversion of the Saarland. And they felt that they would be on their own, and they adapted basically a policy of appeasement. So much so that by 1929, people could not reference Verdun. They shall not pass, the great slogan at Verdun, that was considered taboo, warlike, belligerent, aggressive pose, and French school people were learning that Verdun was basically the ossuary at Verdun. It was not a heroic moment where French civilization had stopped Prussian aggression. So that was one of the lessons that was going to lead to World War II, that no matter how spectacular your resistance to Germany had been, no matter how sophisticated French technology was in World War I and in between the wars, it was a psychological crisis that France underwent, that they thought that they could never resist Germany unless they had allies that would join them on the continent, and that was not going to happen again, and they would have to make the necessary adjustments. If you look at Britain, France lost more men than any of the allies, of 1.7 to 2.1, depending on whose figures you use. But Britain lost second, over 1 million, probably 1.2 million. In the British mind, this had been a catastrophic disaster because it went against every element of British strategy. All the way back to the Napoleonic Wars, the idea was Britain does not get into a continental war with either France, but especially Germany. It had the most sophisticated appraisal of the Prussian General Staff. It understood that you could not win a land war against Germany. The way you defeated an army was to nibble at their periphery, use sea power, blockade. It did that in World War I. But unfortunately, it had, because of the dire circumstances by 1915, it poured men and materiel into the continent. After World War I was over, in the British mindset, we are not going to get engaged, and we're not going to have another Somme, and we're not going to be in league with the French because we will end up in another land war. This was so pervasive that it not only encouraged an ideology of appeasement, but even in World War II, the so-called Second Front controversy between the Americans and the British, Churchill, he said in his memoirs that he had nightmares of Passchendaele and the Somme. And so even in World War II, there was always a soft underbelly going into the Balkans, going into Italy, going into Rhodes of all places, North Africa, but you did not want to do what the Americans had demanded, land on the continent and go straight into the heart of Germany, because if you did, you'd end up in a war of attrition against this superb army. That was a lesson, basically, that the British learned, and it was very deleterious because at each stroke of Hitler's aggrandizement, whether it was into the Rhineland or the Saar or the Anschluss or Czechoslovakia, the British, behind their appeasement was always, we cannot afford to get into a land war on the continent because it will inevitably result in something analogous to our sacrifice in World War I. Germany had a very different reaction to World War I. There were a few voices, not many, who understood that the Versailles Treaty was not necessarily that punitive, especially given that they understood what they had imposed on Russia and what they would have imposed on the Allies. So they understood that, but it was politically toxic to say that. And out of this idea was that Germany felt that if they were to recapture territory, east and west, if they were to recapture glory and influence, they would have to have a type of warfare that was not a war of attrition on either two fronts. And out of this, they learned some valuable but ultimately catastrophic lessons. The first was they felt that they could create a new type of warfare. We call it blitzkrieg. They never used that term, but sharp armor thrust supported by close air support with independent operating armor divisions would, almost like Alexander the Great at the Battle of Gaugamela, punch through a hole, get to the rear of the enemy, cause a catastrophic collapse in enemy morale, and win the war outright without having to have a sort of a Verdun. And they were so confident, they'd seen a little bit of it in the Spanish Civil War, that when they went into Poland, when they divided up with the Soviet Union it was absolutely impressive. They went in, as you know, into Denmark in 1 day. And in the spring, they overran Holland, Belgium, and France in less than 30 days. And everybody said blitzkrieg is the way of the future. But notice, there were a few voices, even Guderian, who was one of the architects, that said, this is not a serious way of looking at war. This is an anecdote to World War I, but there is no substitute for men on the ground, a sophisticated industrial base, materiel, and widespread conscription. The German economy was not mobilized to the degree that Britain was. Think of this for a minute. Germany had almost double the potential industrial output of Britain, and in World War II, Britain produced more tanks and more planes than Germany alone. The United States produced 6 times more than Germany, but Britain alone, even during the Blitz, while Britain was being attacked, it produced more Spitfires than Germany did on attack, basically, with 109 fighters. They never really mobilized because they were convinced that the way to win the war, unlike World War I, was quick lightning spread. And what was the real lesson? Blitzkrieg was a brilliant way of fighting a border war against a European neighbor that had sophisticated roads and did not require a lot of logistical capability. So if Poland's next to Germany, France is next to Germany. You have, the road system is integrated. You can collapse these Western democracies who are not, they're not authoritarian. They, as Hitler said, I've seen them at Munich, they're worms, et cetera, et cetera. However, the first time Blitzkrieg was asked to engage with a real enemy, Britain, which required sophisticated air support independent of close air support of tanks or an amphibious capability or a surface fleet, it was absolutely unable to do anything against Britain. It lost the Battle of Britain within 5 months. Catastrophic losses, over 2,000 airframes, which would really hurt it in the Soviet Union. So then, not learning that lesson, Hitler thought, well, we really didn't try Blitzkrieg because we couldn't. He didn't envision that when you wage war, you have to have multifaceted assets. And if England is on an island, just because you can't get to it really matters. You can't get to it. So what good is Blitzkrieg if you can't get there? So when they went into the Soviet Union in June 1941, they were warned that the Soviet Union, unlike France, does not have a good road system. They warned that the German economy was still not on a war footing. They warned them that not only did the Soviet Union have 5 times as many artillery platforms and tanks, but they already had about 400 T-34s that were better than anything, and that the Mark I, Mark II, Mark III tanks were all obsolete, and even their new Mark IV was obsolete in comparison to the latest Russian. And Blitzkrieg essentially died within 4 months on the suburbs of Moscow. A little bit in 1942, but after that, especially its epitaph was at Kursk, the Battle of Kursk. So the lesson that Germany got from World War I is not that you don't fight a two-front war necessarily, not that they had fought pretty well and you mobilize your entire economy, you have large infantry and armor, but you could win on the cheap because National Socialism and Blitzkrieg would batter a potential enemy into psychological paralysis. Notice one other thing that happened to Germany in this theme of drawing the wrong lessons. They had this crazy equation that permeated the Nazi Wehrmacht, and that was that in World War I, they had fought 4 years, and they had never gone more than 70 miles westward. However, they had knocked out the Soviet Union in 2.5 years. In that calculus, 4 to 2.5, they thought, wow, and the next time we fight, the same problem will be on the West, and yet the West fell in 30 days. In Hitler's way of thinking, if the West fell in 30 days, according to the World War I calculation, the East will fall in 2 weeks. And even Halder in his diary thought, he said after the 11th day, the war in the East is essentially won, Halder being the head of the German army. So Germany came away humiliated, but not taking the necessary steps to mobilize in such a way as the Kaiser had. As far as Russia, after the Versailles Treaty and its experience in World War I think even though it was a much different government, the idea was you could never trust the Allies because the constant complaint, even in World War I from the Tsar, was that they are pulling back when Germany has an offensive against us, even though the Russians were doing that themselves. So you can't fight with France and Britain against Germany because there's not going to be close cooperation, and one side is always going to have some advantage over the other. So we were knocked out in World War I, and what did the Allies do? They kept fighting, but did they demand of Germany that it nullify that treaty? No, it was Woodrow Wilson who did that in the 14 points. So although the Russian people, and to a lesser extent Stalin, had goodwill toward the Americans, they were very distrustful of the Allies in World War I, and that meant that World War II started, as I said, not just because of appeasement and the bad combination of humiliating Germany without enforcing the statutes of the Versailles Treaty, but basically because of Russia. If Russia had have been neutral, and rather than a partisan in a non-aggression pact, or had Russia been allied with France and Britain, there wouldn't have been a World War II. Hitler wouldn't have made that gamble that he did in 1939 by going into Poland. He went into Poland because he knew that the Soviet Union was going to go into Poland from the east, and the Soviet Union was not going to attack him, but supply him precious metals, oil, wheat, while he destroyed the democracies in the West. As Churchill said to Stalin when Stalin complained about the absence of a second front, "Don't lecture me, Marshal Stalin." When bombs were falling on London, they were fueled by Russian oil. And so the Russians had a very, very distrustful idea of the West, and they were not necessarily on board with our allies. Remember, in World War II, Russia was the only power of the five that made a deal with everybody. At one time, they were an ally of the Germans, non-aggression pact. They signed a non-aggression pact with the Japanese in April of 1941, and then they switched over and joined the Allies. They were an enemy and an ally of all the combatants, all five, the only power that did that. And keep in mind that, in a very strange way, Russia, in this idea that after World War I and after these catastrophic losses of territory and population, that they were going to be as distrustful of their friends as they were of their enemies, that one of the reasons Japan attacked us, why did they attack us? It made no sense. It was one of these inexplicable things. And the answer was that in 1939, the Japanese were engaged in a major border war with Russia. Major border war. They didn't do very well, but one of the reasons they didn't do very well was that Hitler, right in the middle of it, signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin and pulled the rug out from their Japanese ally. Japan was very angry about that, and the army lost face. And in April of 1941, Japan did to Germany what Germany had done to it. It signed a non-aggression pact with Russia. And that was infuriated Mr. Ribbentrop and Goebbels. They thought, why would they do to us what we did to them? But what it essentially did is it opened up it kept secure, I should say, his Eastern Front, and it would be very important during the siege of Moscow that he could bring 200,000 Siberian troops and didn't have to fear the Japanese. But more importantly, when Stalin did that, he was basically saying to the Japanese, turn westward. Turn westward. And the army lost prestige. They were bogged down in Manchuria. And the Navy stepped forward and said, we're going to go westward against the Americans, something that Stalin knew would happen with that non-aggression pact. So the suspicion of the Soviet Union came out of World War I. It was very influential in the interwar years. It probably helped cause World War II much more than any problem with the Versailles Treaty. Had Russia just been a lukewarm ally of its previous wartime partners, you probably wouldn't have had World War II. And then we come to the Americans. What lessons did we learn? And we learned a lot of lessons, military, strategic, political. One of the military lessons was, it was very naive, I suppose, is that we don't really have to arm. We declare war in April, and the next April we have 1 million men. We land on the continent. These guys have been fighting for 4 years, American can-do know-how. We don't have any tanks, we don't have any airplanes, but we just plow into Germany and we win the war. And as the Americans said, Pershing said, why did you call it off? He was right about that. It was November 1918, after these guys had fought for 4 years, they'd finally defeated the German army. All they had to do was go another 34, 40 miles. They would have been into German territory. They could have gone right to Berlin, and they could have taken that entire argument away from Hitler 15 years later. We were stabbed in the back. We never surrendered on our own territory. We were on the offensive in France and Belgium when the communists and the Jews stabbed us in the back. Pershing had predicted that. Marshal Foch had said that. The Versailles Treaty the problem is we didn't go into Germany. Had the Americans gone into Germany and occupied the country and humiliated the Germans, said, you really lost the war. You lost it on both fronts. You had Russia knocked out. When you had one front, you couldn't even defeat it. This idea that, well, we had to fight on two fronts, Pershing was saying, no, you lost the Eastern Front, and you still got to beat, even when you put 100 divisions and transferred. So in our way of thinking, we were confident that the answer to defeating Germany in World War II is to do what we did in World War I. And so in these arguments with our allies, especially the British, we kept saying we want a single front. We want to help Stalin take the pressure off him like we did in World War I. We want to land in Normandy, and we want to do it in 1942. And the British, who knew much more about war in 1942 than we did, said, you guys are absolutely crazy. You don't have naval superiority, you don't have air superiority, you don't have amphibious capability. So, of course, General Marshall said, we'll do it in late 42. Churchill, who had other agenda said, let's go to Africa, and then we went to Africa, let's go to Sicily, let's go to Italy, but let's not meet the Wehrmacht like we did in World War I on an equal basis. We didn't have those inhibitions. And so part of our estrangement with our allies was we kept thinking it's going to be World War I. We had not suffered 1,000,000.1 casualties like the British or 1.7 like the French. We'd lost 117,000 tragically fatalities in World War I. We thought we could do the same thing in World War II, just rush in. Didn't happen that way. Another thing that happened from Versailles, and it was a lesson on American foreign policy, was if you were to ask an American in 1930, what do you think of World War I and the Versailles Treaty, he would have been very angry. From what we know of public opinion, we don't know much, but it was this general sense that most Americans thought World War I had been a waste and the Versailles Treaty had been a greater waste. And they felt that largely because of the Depression, which they felt had somehow involved World War I, and they felt that the Germans had welched out on their reparations to the Allies, and Britain had welched out. As Calvin Coolidge said, we rented them the money, didn't they? And they didn't pay the $4 billion back. So we were angry about that, and then with the rise of National Socialism, we thought the Great War didn't do any good. And so the isolationist movement was pretty much predominant. We were perfectly willing to allow Britain to be bombed in in September of 1940. It didn't bother us. We didn't go in to save France. We were perfectly willing to allow that to happen. We were very ambiguous about Lend-Lease and giving material support to the Russians. Pat Buchanan wrote a book not long ago suggesting that was so did Diana West. I think very simplistically, but there was a great argument whether we should even have helped the Soviet Union. We only went into the war when we were attacked. If you look at the belligerents, every belligerent on the Allied side, except one that's surviving, was pretty realistic. The idealistic partner was Britain. Britain went to war when it was not attacked on the principle of saving Poland. Russia didn't do that. Russia was aiding Germany. The only reason Russia was an ally was because it was attacked. The only reason the United States got into the war because it was attacked by Japan. We wouldn't probably have not declared war on Germany if Germany had not declared war on us. That was the second stupidest thing of the war that Hitler did after invading Russia, and he only did it because the Kriegsmarine said, you know, all these ripe targets, we can starve Britain out, our submarines will just destroy American convoys, they don't have any tanks, it was just ludicrous, but the United States would not have intervened in World War II had Hitler not declared war on us. The lessons that we got then for most of the interwar period was we screwed up in World War I, we won't do it again, and if we do it again, we're just going to go in there very quickly and invade it. And they were all the wrong lessons, I think. After World War II and the victory over Hitler, we did something very different. Now we come to the final part of this talk. What were the real lessons of World War II is that we are not going to have another Versailles Treaty. Not in the sense that Versailles was necessarily flawed, but it was never enforced. And although it did have the right idea of assigning all the blame to Germany and occupying the Rhineland, it had the wrong idea by not occupying all of Germany and taking even more territory. Remember, in 1947, the Allies met and decided linguistically that the word Prussia, sort of like the word Vandal or Byzantine in our vocabulary, they don't represent people anymore, do they? They're criminals or bureaucrats. So they just decided that the word Prussian no longer existed. You could call somebody a Prussian as an authoritarian, but there was never to be a Prussia again. 13 million German speakers outside the Reich were forcibly removed. We'd worry about the Palestinian issue, but about the same time, about 10 times more people were removed from their homeland. They were forced into Germany. It was divided into 4 zones, later 3 plus 1, against 1, I should say. And that peace treaty was Carthaginian. We didn't quite do what the Morgenthau Plan was to deindustrialize Germany. At one point, Churchill asked Roosevelt what he should do about Germany. He said, I think we should castrate German males so they don't do it a 4th time. So there was a punitive peace, a Carthaginian peace that in every aspect was far more severe than the Versailles Treaty, and it kept the peace in a way that the Versailles had not for 70 years as we speak. Which I'll finish on a certain disturbing, so the lesson sort of is, what causes these wars? Why do they break out, and how do they end? And I think you could say World War I and World War II both is that certain bad actors at certain times try to do something that may be logically stupid. And they may think it's not rationally smart to do something, go invade France in 1914, or invade France in 1940, or attack the Soviet Union, but they think they can get away with it. They think they can get away with it because the perception of deterrence is lost. Why did Hitler go into the Soviet Union? Stupidest thing in the world. Because the Soviet Union had performed very poorly under its deal in 1939 to divide Poland. It never made its demarcation points. Hitler said they liquidated the entire officer class of 35,000 officers in 1938. They went into Finland. They did very poorly. It took them 6 months to win that battle, and they're not very good. And some of his generals said, no, they're very good. The problem is they fight very poorly when they're outside their home territory. Put them on their own home territory, and they're the best fighters in the world. But the point was, it was a perception. Just like the Falklands War. That's a stupid thing. Remember the great novelist Borges says, two bald men fighting over a comb? Why would Argentina think they could get away in invading Falklands and attacking the country that produced Nelson and Wellington? And the answer is that a backbencher in the British Parliament had used the word Malvinas. They had withdrawn their only one minesweeper, and they had a new prime minister who was female, who didn't have cojones or machismo, as the Argentine dictator said. That's an ironic joke, isn't it? With Margaret Thatcher. So they thought they could get away with it. I could adduce other examples from April Glaspie saying to Saddam Hussein in August 1990, we don't have an interest in border disputes. But it's not whether you're strong or weak, but it's the perception of such and the ability to use power. France was stronger than Germany in 1939, especially with Britain, but it was weaker psychologically and morally. That's what starts wars. And then what happens when war breaks out? What was the lessons of World War I, World War II? Everybody makes mistakes, and the side that wins makes the fewest, or at least corrects them most quickly. Turned out that Stalin, for all of his authoritarian propensities, was much more flexible and delegated authority to much more talented people than Hitler did, and overrode decisions much less rarely after 1942. And the United States made a host of blunders that would have made the Iraq War look like an amateur. I mean, nothing compared to World War II. I mean, we bombed our own soldiers in Operation Cobra on the trials for D-Day. We let 5 German speedboats come in and kill 700 soldiers. We blew up General McNair ourselves, 3-star general. We did all sorts of things that were crazy. We had this idea of tank destroyers. We said the Sherman tank could take on any tank after 1943, which it couldn't for all its advantages. So the point is that how well did you react to it? The United States and Britain and even Russia reacted to its mistakes much more vigorously and quickly than did the Axis powers, partly because in the West, at least, we were democratic, and in World War I, it was the same. And finally, what ends these wars? What was the lesson that we learned? And unfortunately, it doesn't mean you can end them all the way you like, but if you defeat the enemy and humiliate them and make them subject to the terms of your political ideologies, then there's less likely to be a war. So after World War I, we did not go into Germany, and we had World War II. After World War II, we said we're not only going to go into Germany, we're going to fault them completely, we're going to humiliate them, we're going to occupy them, we're going to make them good Democrats. And we did. We did the same thing with Italy, we did the same thing with Japan. We tried to do it in other places. We tried to do it in Iraq, we're trying to do it in Afghanistan. I guess we're trying to make Afghanistan into Carmel. But the idea was that you defeat the enemy and then you don't have to go in again if you create some type of economic prosperity or political stability. That was a lesson that we learned from World War I that we did not follow, and we followed it for World War II. And so now I guess what we are left with is the post-war order, this 70-year idea that both Democrats and Republicans embrace was based on lessons that you do not do what we did after World War I, but you do what we do after World War II. You create a sort of a 14 points, freedom of the seas, open commerce, and like the Roman imperators of old, every once in a while when a Jugurtha or Vercingetorix or a Boudicca raises her head up, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Manuel Noriega or Milosevic, you take them down. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's messy. Sometimes North Korea is sort of so-so, sometimes Vietnam, so Iraq. But you try to keep outliers from endangering the system, and then with rogue nations or nations that challenge this post-war order, whether during communism or afterwards, China or Russia or Iran, you try to contain them. Or you hope that your economic vibrancy or political influence or popular culture will weaken them in the long run while you contain their ability. And that's what we were trying to do. I think that every president since World War II has embraced that vision. Jimmy Carter, for all of his faults, remember, I have no inordinate fear of communism. Not one soldier will die under my watch. And then suddenly China invades Vietnam, Russia goes into Afghanistan, the Shah falls, hostages, communists, and then what did he do? I was mistaken in my impressions of the Soviet Union. Here's the Carter Doctrine. I increased defense larger than Reagan did even. So he came to his senses. I think this is the first presidency we have now where administration, I don't think, has studied World War I or World War II or appreciates that the post-war order has created the greatest level of prosperity, personal freedom, security in the history of civilization, but it requires an engagement of the United States. It requires an explication of the abnormalities of the post-war order. There are a lot of abnormalities. Japan should have nuclear weapons. It's earned it by its economic prowess. Taiwan should have nuclear weapons. South Korea, but they don't because they're under our nuclear umbrella. So you don't negotiate with the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, Russia, unilaterally and say you're going to lower it down to 500 deployable weapons when South Korea says, I need a couple of hundred for us, and Japan says, I'd like to have 1,000 psychologically, and Australia and New Zealand. Putin doesn't have those responsibilities, so why negotiate with him on that topic? Or you tell people in Europe, we have to stay engaged, you have to spend 3% of your budget because it's an anomaly. Germany should have nuclear weapons. It's earned it. It's the most financially robust economy in Europe. Why is France and Britain and not? Well, it has nuclear. It doesn't have nuclear weapons because we have absorbed its security needs. And NATO said Russia out, us in, Germany down. So when you want to disengage from Europe or you want to disengage from the Pacific, there will be radical changes in the post-war order. Or if you want to lead from behind or you want to have deadlines or red lines or step over lines, I don't really care whether it was wise or not to go into these different places. You can argue either way, but the point is you don't talk loudly and carry a small stick because you endanger this post-war order that was so difficult to achieve and was based on lessons that were won with such blood and treasure lost in World War II and World War I. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Luke Coffey. I'm the Margaret Thatcher Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation, so of course I find your Falkland Islands comments interesting. Actually, but I wanted to ask specifically about Italy. You at least mentioned Prime Minister Orlando.
Yes.
When you went around the block discussing the different belligerents, Italy wasn't mentioned at all.
Yes.
And I was wondering, how did how we treated Italy as an ally after World War I, how did that, in your opinion, lead to some of the problems with Italy going into World War II and them adopting fascism, this idea of reclaiming the irredenti, the unredeemed provinces that they felt like they deserved after losing 500,000 people during World War I?
They lost 1 million total in World War I.
So,
and I was just in Trieste a month ago, and that area. And the thing is that Italy kind of flipped, didn't they? In 1913 or 1914, they were more or less aligned with the Central Powers, and they made the rational calculations and felt that it would be in their interest as far as the Dalmatian coast area to stay with the Allied powers. That was important because they didn't have the economic or military power that the other three allies had done, and they felt that by coming into the war and really taking on the large southern flank of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, that they deserved more than what they got, whereas the Allies thought they'd given them too much because they elevated Orlando to a theoretical co-equal status with the big three, which he didn't deserve, and they felt that Italy had flipped. This was important because this charge against Italy would also be true in World War II. Churchill, Daladier, Roosevelt were courting Italy in the same way. They felt that just as they'd done in World War I, they could flip. It was catastrophic, though, in World War II, because when they did flip, it wasn't, I mean, Mussolini was deposed after the invasion of Sicily, and then Germany quite brutally took over Italy's belligerent role and shipped over 1 million Italians to forced labor in Germany, and they were treated worse than any other European foreign force except maybe the Russians. And when they went into places like Greece that Italy was occupying, they executed 7,000 Italian peacekeepers. So Italy paid a terrible price in World War II as well, but it had this reputation that it was opportunistic. It was not deeply, even though it had made enormous sacrifices. And I think in the Italian point of view is they felt that they were not going to ally themselves with the Allies again and be given this terrible responsibility of dealing with the Germanic people's southern flank. They just weren't up to it, and Mussolini would rather join them. And once he saw the appeasement, this is very important vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin, I think. Once Mussolini studied very carefully the Rhineland, the Saarland, the Anschluss, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the fall of France. He didn't join Hitler in any of this until France was almost falling. Then he came in late June, you know. And his way of thinking is, I'm not going to come in until I know who's going to win. Once France fell, he said, there's no more French fleet. The British have destroyed it. So in his way of thinking, I have a monopoly now in the Mediterranean. So it was this idea that they had been burned so badly in World War I and they didn't have the wherewithal to be a major power, so they were not going to play that role again. But they had a terrible reputation, both among the Allies and the Germans, of being duplicitous. Other questions? Yes?
Tom Oakley, just a visitor. Back to this idea that economic development creates stability that Walt Rostow sort of proffered in the Johnson administration.
Yes.
And I just wanted to know that, you know, people have tried to take that parallel between Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes.
That hadn't worked so well, and sort of it worked well after World War II,
Yes.
a little bit after World War I. But is that parallel valid in the future?
Well, I don't mean that I'm not part of the great illusion that the idea that countries that are economically prosperous and so interconnected will never go to war. That was the idea in 1913, that there would never be a great war because of the interconnectedness of the new world order of the 20th century. But what I'm suggesting is that to the degree that a country is economically viable and it has some political stability, then it's less likely to be aggressive, so to speak. And the problem that we had, I think, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I'm not faulting either administration, it's just that we put the proverbial cart before the horse, because in modern warfare it is very difficult to impose a level of violence on in a CNN or Fox News or globally televised environment to defeat and humiliate and occupy an enemy. And yes, unfortunately, that's the formula since Roman times if you want to change the hearts and minds and impose an economic and political system that otherwise you can't have. So if you want to go into Iraq and you don't want Saddam to translate oil wealth into aggrandizement as he had and kill over 1 million of his own people, then you can take him out, and then you're going to have chaos, and it's going to be on TV, and you're going to be sort of like Libya. But so if you're going to stay, you're going to have to, you know, you're going to have to be something like Abu Ghraib, which was sexual humiliation. It was terrible, but not one real Iraqi died. That's not quite the Holocaust as it was compared to by some people. So it's very hard for a postmodern democracy to follow that classical equation of defeat, humiliation, rehabilitation, occupation, partnership. We want to have partnership before all those steps have happened, and I don't think we're up to it anymore.
One more question.
Yeah. That's it.
Masugi,
Yeah.
good to see you again. My question concerns the role of utopianism in American foreign policy.
Yes.
I read this horrible novel, Philip Drew Administrator, which predicts a military coup in the United States, and the dictator, Philip Drew, establishes a progressive form of government. The novel was written by Colonel House, who
Yes.
was, of course, a close advisor to Wilson. And so with that as sort of a lead-in, do you see a utopian impulse in Wilson? Certainly it was there in his reform.
I'm just saying that of all his dangerous utopian impulses, the one that we most readily identify is the 14 points. But if you were to actually look at the 14 points, other than this stuff about the League of Nations stuff, they're actually pretty traditional and conservative. They make pretty good sense. They were basically a reaction to two things. One is the Allies had promised a lot of secret deals on the Balkans. France and Britain had to gain Greece into the war, and they had sort of sold out Italy, and that was a secret agreement. And the second was that they weren't too concerned about the loss of, as I said, 25% of Russian territory. And so Wilson was basically saying, we're going to have everything that was naive, but everything transparent, and we're going to restore what Russia lost, even though it's a Marxist government now that we don't like. But utopianism was this idea, I think, was dangerous about the League of Nations, that no country should have the right to declare war unless the major powers agreed with it. It was absolutely unenforceable, and it led to the humiliation of this idea of collectivism with Ethiopia and Manchuria. But Wilson was, in his domestic policy, I mean, even on matters of race, eugenics, he was a utopian in a very disturbing way in a lot of ways. And the more you read about, Roosevelt as well, I've been reading an exchange of letters from Roosevelt and Churchill. Roosevelt was a great wartime leader, but if you read what he wrote Churchill, you don't know whether it's serious or not. Like, because I don't have any colonial stain in my country, I'm going to deal with Uncle Joe, and I'm going to cut you out at Tehran, and I'm going to maybe not talk to you before. And I think that if you give Uncle Joe what he wants, then he'll be so reciprocal, and he'll appreciate that. He won't make these demands in Eastern Europe. And I know that those officers in Poland could have been, maybe in theory, could have been killed by Russians, but let's not say so. I got a poll for this idea that after the war, the Soviet Union, United States, I think it would be fair, and it wouldn't be a reactionary slur on the reputation of Roosevelt, that unlike Harry Truman, I think by the time he died, he really did believe that Britain was through, and it should be through, because it had caused most of the problems in the world, and that the Soviet Union, under the tutelage of the United States, was going to evolve from its communist barbarism into a sort of a European socialism. And it was almost there, because the United States had partnered. And I think that caused a lot of problems, and thank God for Harry Truman. Thank you.
So I have only two administrative tasks. One is we're going to have a reception of the floor, so please join us. And the second is join me again in thanking our speaker.